This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. I am on location again this week in the Bay Area of California, sitting in the offices of East Brother Beer Company with head brewer Paul Liszewski. Welcome to the podcast, Paul.
Thanks for stopping by, Jamie.
I am thrilled to be out again, traveling around the country and being able to do these things in person. And it's an incredible week that I've got ahead of me. And people that listen to the podcast will learn more about that later on. But I'm not going to ruin any of those surprises. We're going to talk about lager brewing because that is something the East Brother has set out to do here in the San Francisco Bay Area, creating a decidedly old school approach to beer. I shouldn't say old school. I should just say classic and timeless approach to beer, to kind of complement the other cities' beer offerings. And you all have done a fantastic job with it. You've won, medal for Bo Pills and other things. And so we're going to talk about pre-pro lager. We're going to talk about Bohemian Pilsner. We're going to talk about red lager and some of the other lager brewing that you all do. Before we do that, G&D Chillers, born in the Pacific Northwest from a lot of hard work and a singular goal, they've become the best damn chiller company in the world. Like you, G&D never settles. They're relentless and strive to be better every single day because they take pride in the work they do. They are craftsmen who know good enough won't cut it. Visit G&D Chillers at CBC booth 3011. That's 3011. Or reach out directly at gdchillers.com. And I noticed you guys have a GD Chillers chiller out there, don't you, Paul?
We do. And I had a chuckle because I was listening to the Cloudburst podcast this morning, and they threw out an endorsement for them. And they've been awesome, great customer service, and we're built to expand with them for sure.
Well, I just put you on the spot, and I didn't mean to do that. This episode is also brought to you by RAR North Star Pils, a new base malt to set your compass by. RAR North Star Pils is crafted for brewers looking for a domestic Pilsner malt with low color and low modification. North Star Pils carries overtones of honey and sweet bread, supported by flavors and aromas of hay and a nutty character. Suitable for any beer style, but particularly craft brewed versions of classic lagers. Let RAR North Star Pils guide your craft by visiting bsgcraftbrewing.com or contact them at 1-800-374-2739. So, Paul, give me the Paul history and a bit of the East Brother history. Kind of walk us through East Brother, and then also talk about how you got here and your path through the world of brewing.
Cool. So East Brother, we've been here in Richmond for almost 5 years now. Started by Chris Coomber and Rob Leitner. They were neighbors. Started drinking and doing some homebrew together, and just found that they loved it and decided to pursue it further. They stumbled upon Richmond when they were going around looking for locations, and they kind of fell in love with the city of Richmond. It's kind of their motto is pride and purpose, and which we've kind of adopted it as our own. But it says a lot about the kind of the work ethos of the city of Richmond. But as they were driving across the Richmond Bridge, they noticed the East Brother lighthouse, and so not only they found a location, they also found a name,
a symbol. This is it's kind of a working class port town, and and it actually feels a lot like San Pedro in kind of LA, south of LA area. And that it's a place where a lot of that kind of commerce of ocean travel and shipping and everything else happens. And so it just definitely feels of the earth here.
Yeah. And Rosie the Riveter was right in this area. In fact, where our brewery was the area where they used to have the Rosie the Riveter dormitories back in World War II. So just a lot of industrial history here, and again, back to the pride and purpose. They drove a war effort, and there was purpose, and it just continues to this day. So,
and the kind of beers reflect that same kind of ethos. They're not too fancy. They are well made, and they're well crafted, and that seems to be your approach around it.
Yeah, and they work.
Yeah. So you came out of Siebel and then pursued a professional career from there.
Yeah. So after close to 20 years in tech, I had enough of cubes. Was dabbling in home brewing. I shouldn't say dabbling, but a growing addiction to making my own beer.
Sure.
And decided I need to make a change, and went to Siebel, got my associate's degree in brewing technology, and saw the value in education. And I'm not a spring chicken, so having certification behind what you're doing,
sure,
following my passion and into a new career.
And you've worked at other breweries before coming to East Brother?
Yeah, I got my start at Devil's Canyon Brewing Company in San Carlos. They're a contract brewing company, as well as running their own house brand. They've been about 20 years, so they got some brewing experience. But what I really liked about it was I got to brew other breweries' beer and get exposed to many different styles and recipe design and kind of business directions. And yeah, it was kind of exciting. And, it was more exciting going into like the opening night of San Francisco Beer Week and walking down the aisle and being going, oh, I brewed that. I brewed that one. But it was also...
There's a nice discipline to that too, where, you need to brew it this way, and you need to learn how to brew it and learn why they brew it that way. So you can reach that goal and have, achieve these kinds of brand standards across all of those things. No, that's...
Yeah. We had to hit, I'm brewing someone else's recipe, and I have to hit their target numbers and, live up to their expectations of what they want that beer to be, and, trying to get inside the head of another brewer and what they want and how they want it done. So
then you decided to sign on here with East Brother, and you walk in, and they had a framework, for the beer at East Brother, and it was a very traditionally minded framework. Talk to me about getting involved in this and kind of joining midstream where there was a beer program in place, and then finding your role in all of that.
Sure. There was a little bit of time to, understand the recipes and what they were trying to accomplish. Lucky, Chris and I share the kind of same brew philosophy, an approach to traditional beer, and kind of being very meticulous about how it's produced and, repeatability from batch to batch. And then, just start taking a look at, I don't want to say, flaws, but how can we make the beer better? And, we're a packaging brewery. So looking at, how long does that beer last in a can? How does it look? How does it taste? What are the aromas? And just kind of making methodical, incremental changes batch after batch and addressing those. One of my first tasks was to come up with a seasonal series, and we immediately were drawn to the lager series. The Bow Pills and the Red Lager make up more than 50% of our sales. And it's like, well, we should do something with lagers. So now I was tasked with, all right, I need to pick 4 lagers, out of an entire list. And it was fun because it was like, oh, what do I want to drink?
Sure.
But it's also, what do other people want to drink and whatnot. So
we should say it wasn't the initial plan for East Brother. The idea was not necessarily, hey, let's build a lager brewery from day one. You've got a whole bunch of 20 barrel fermenters out there that are not optimized for lager fermentation, that suggest that wasn't the initial vision. And then you've got another part of the cellar back here with much, much larger tanks that are definitely geared for that kind of lager brewing. That showcase that kind of evolution of the brewery and the focus as you went on. Talk to me a little bit about how that happened. I mean, it's such an interesting thing for a brewery to say, hey, we're going to go with what's working. And it's a weird one when what's working is a Bohemian Pilsner or a red lager.
Yeah, something that takes 6 weeks to make.
Where we're all of a sudden right now, oh wait, we may not have been set up perfectly for that in the past, but we've got to lean into that.
Yeah, as we know, ales are basically 2 weeks and done. By the time you
and you make a fair amount of those too, and you make some really beautiful traditional style ales. Sure.
But that 20 barrel tank I can turn 3 times in 6 weeks. When you look at a 20 barrel batch of lagers that takes 6 weeks to make, realistically you're 3 barrels a week in sales. And as we know, that doesn't go very far. And
packaging lager in cans and then selling it at a price point that people will pay for, even for craft lager, means it's got to be a volume play.
Yeah. And so before I got here, they already had a couple of 60 barrel fermenters in place. And, since I've been here, we've doubled in sales year over year, with the exception of last year. We did show a little bit of growth even during through COVID. But it was very apparent that, our lagers were becoming, more in focus and more in demand. And, when you're trying to forecast that out, what am I going to brew? I could tie up all 5 of those 20 barrels and still be woefully behind.
Sure.
We've expanded quite a bit since I've been here, and we're still, I think today was the first day I didn't see a bunch of red dates in my calendar. We're still small enough that our brew schedule can be a little bit more fluid. And it was a little refreshing. It was the first Monday I haven't seen like red. You should have brewed this 3 weeks ago. I can't do that.
What's the overall volume for the brewery now? Or where are you on track for this year?
We did about 2,500 barrels, a little over 2,500 barrels last year. We're going to surpass that in the next couple of weeks. And we're looking probably over 5,000 barrels by the end of the year.
Wow. Okay.
So, kegs are back.
Yeah. And so, one thing you mentioned was that sales of the lagers are more than 50% of brewery sales now.
Yeah, we're approaching 60% on our lagers.
So that's a significant line of business for you all that was not necessarily intended originally, but something. So talk to me then about the kind of creative process, or I should say, let's talk about that kind of creative and design process and how you all have come up with an identity for these lagers. But before we do that, the world of craft beer is a different place now. Margins are more important than ever, so why not lower your ingredient cost? Craft juice concentrates from Old Orchard are the cost-effective solution for your fruit-forward needs. Old Orchard produces high volumes of their retail juice brand, so economies of scale keep prices low for their bulk supply program. A little concentrate goes a long way, and you won't lose some of it through filtering like you would with purees. To start increasing your margins now, head on over to www.oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, with nearly 20 years of innovation and experience, Brewmation specializes in electric, steam, and direct fire brew houses, complete cellar solutions, and automated controls for the craft brewing industry. From half barrel to 30 barrel systems, Brewmation puts you in control to design a brewery that fits your needs and your brewing style. Whether you're starting a new brewery, upgrading your cellar, or just need some parts to keep you up and running, Brewmation has you covered. Visit them at brewmation.com to get started. So yeah, Paul, let's talk about the kind of design basics behind your lagers. You had a couple in place when you joined the brewery, and so I know you can't really talk about the formation of those, but you've definitely put fine points on it. Let's kind of start with Bo Pils, and this is a beer that you've won a GABF medal for. Talk to me a little bit about the kind of design inspiration behind it and where it came from, and how you have shepherded this beer, as you've brewed it more often.
Sure. It was a recipe that I guess I've kind of adopted as my own now. And it's...
I like that. It's mine now.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure I'll get razzed for this when our Wednesday managers call. But
it is your responsibility to make it good.
Yes. And I guess, what Siebel has led to me is just be much more scientific about how you brew beer. It's making a one-off recipe sometimes is almost easy because you have nothing to base it upon, and you drink it and then you write down your notes, and this is how I would do it better the next time. So you brew it different. For me, I need to make the same beer every single time, and as I tweak the recipe either to balance out the hops or perfect the water profile, or we haven't been happy with kind of the malt presence or the mouthfeel. There's just so many levers that we can manipulate to kind of make the beer that we want it to be. But I also have this, I need to make sure that beer tastes as good and fresh in that can, in the groceries aisle, a week after it was packaged or 6 months out of packaging. So, we're looking at, DO levels and, making sure the beer is absolutely clear, free of anything. And just tweaking the brewing process itself,
was there an original idea behind it? Was there hey, it should have this malt, let's use this yeast? I mean, I imagine with the lager program, you all have tried to standardize your approach to yeast across, in a way that works for all of these lagers. I'm curious about the kind of creative point of view that you brought to it. What was that original inspiration, and how'd you guys go around just helping develop that and shape it into what it was going to be?
Sure. Rob and Chris did a lot of batches on their back porch to get the recipe initially. And ironically,
they're brewing Bohemian Pilsner on their back porch as homebrewers. Respect.
Yeah, Chris is he's one of these guys. You give him a problem or a question or what have you, and he'll just keep doing iterations and iterations until it's correct. Ironically, when they first opened the brewery, the original recipe of what they got it down to, well, from, at homebrew scale, you may only need a few ounces of hops and so many pounds. At a commercial scale, those ounces turn into pounds and whatnot. And, sometimes it's hard to get those hops. So the recipe was actually rewritten from day one to meet those demands. And it's, I guess it's just my relationship with Chris and regularly tasting the beers and listening to him and picking up, he was the original and visionary of it, and picking up what he likes about it, and then turning, the little knobs that we can, and amping up, we get just a really, in the Bo Pills, there's still just a little touch of kind of this lemon citrusy character from the hops that really makes you want to go back to drink more. But you still need to preserve that kind of delicate cracker malt snappiness you get out of it. And just trying to preserve that, even if we have to change malt or if we change the yeast. Am I still living up to his true intent?
So it sounds to me as if there's this articulated idea in language about what the beer is, and that the recipe connects to that,
yes,
but that you are still trying to optimize to this kind of linguistic idea of what the beer should be with those kinds of descriptors.
Yes.
Okay. That's cool. I mean, different breweries do it different ways, and I love diving into what is the definition of that beer? Is it this written description of it? Is it these consistent descriptors that you use, and then do you optimize to that, or is it the recipe?
Yeah.
And then however that recipe ends up being, that's what the beer is.
I think the Bo Pills, falls back onto my contract brewing days. I kind of, in some ways, view Chris as my contract brewer, and I'm trying to figure out exactly. Luckily I've had over 3 years to figure that out, and now we kind of make it really consistent and to what he expects. And,
sure.
It takes, I don't want to say skill, but just reading between the lines sometimes.
Yeah.
And
What are some of those core tenets? What are the key definition points that you'd set out for it, and what are some of the ingredient decisions that you've made in order to achieve some of those key points? What are those critical kind of crux pieces there?
It absolutely needs to be clean and flawless every single time. With
so
lager.
It's a lager.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry,
it's as I'm going to hold up my pre-pro or our pre-pro. Sorry, but it's just as clear. There's, it is so pale and there's just nothing behind. If there's any flaw in the beer, it's so apparent. So it's making sure myself and my team is following every single step to exacting details time and time again, but ultimately really caring about what they're doing to achieve that.
And I think that is an excellent piece on the technical execution of it. I just want to stay focused on the kind of creative, the creative piece of it first before we get into that. Because you're right. As Ashley from our Ashley Carter Bierstadt has said, like, it's not doing one thing; it's doing 99 things repeatedly over and over again and doing them perfectly. Mm-hmm. But for this, when you think about ingredients, I mean, there's a lot of things that you can lean on. There's a lot of hops that you can lean on. You all have made some slightly different hops choices than I would say might be considered mainstream for this overall style. And so I'm curious about, what is the definition for that? And what are some of those kinds of choices you've made in building a recipe to kind of achieve some of those creative elements of this?
Luckily, some of those big decisions were made before my time.
It's all right. It's fair enough. You got to execute them, though.
Yeah. The original recipe was written for one particular Pilsner malt and Saaz hops, and both of those ingredients weren't available at the time. We did make a change in yeast a couple years ago, which is really impactful. People really forget how much flavor development is driven from yeast. And
what was the change from what to what?
We changed vendors. We originally chose I really liked the yeast, but unfortunately it wasn't on one of their regular production schedules. So anytime you needed yeast, you had to book it at least 6 weeks out. And 3 years ago, when we're not churning over batch and had to really stretch out our strains, our generations or time between use, it was kind of getting too difficult to hey, I need yeast in 2 weeks, not 6. So
what was the strain that you started with?
It was a Bohemian lager yeast from Y Yeast. And it actually ended up falling really nicely into our lager series for the bulk of them. So it was a pretty big change. When we moved to German lager yeast from White Labs, I like the very clean ferment. For me, it's almost kind of like the 001 of lager yeast. I find it to be very versatile, and it's not imparting a huge flavor of itself onto the beer, and it's very predictable. We get good attenuation, and we're happy with future generations of it.
Works with this 100-barrel cylindro-conical that you're making Bohemian pills in, and works with tank geometry and all of those things.
Yes, and I've always been a big fan of White Labs. Transparency and availability. I can see if it's in stock and when I will get it and choose and blah blah blah.
Sure.
All those fun brewer things that no one talks about.
I mean, those are day-to-day concerns where being having that kind of transparency and visibility also helps you get your job done.
Yeah, especially when you're growing. When you're going from 600-700 barrels a year to 1,500. You can, we generate a lot of yeast in the process, but sometimes it's not fast enough for your growth. And so it's kind of one of the deciding factors. But, you know, when we make a change as impactful as that, I never want the drinker coming up at the bar or picking up the 4-pack at their corner store and going, oh, wow, this batch is really different. So you can also have to devise
sure,
you know, how do I implement this change without anyone noticing it? You know, fortunately, I don't think it was as, you know, flavor-wise in the beer, it wasn't as noticeable to probably 90% of the craft beer drinkers out there. But maybe for us, because we're hypersensitive to what that beer should taste like, you know, so we start blending things in. You know, beer stout is, you know, we make 99 changes, you know, over the course of 99 batches rather than one big change.
Right.
You know, so
change, test, evaluate, you know, adjust.
Yeah. So we do smaller batches, blend them into bigger batches, and, you know, it's almost
like production brewery stuff, right? Yeah. I mean, go figure.
Yeah, exactly. But, you know, are we comfortable with the change, and are we happy with the direction? And, you know, if one batch tastes a little bit different and we pull back on that decision, you know, it's still fine, drinkable, good beer.
Right.
And we go back to the old decision, you know, then, you know, we figure it out, and it's, we're always problem solving. And
sure. Yeah. When you made that yeast change, what was the initial and most immediate kind of impact that you noticed from doing that, and what problems or, you know, what kind of impacts did you then have to adjust for?
Sure. We ferment very cold. We're always on the lower end of the kind of recommended temperatures that the yeast manufacturers, propagators, give to us. The Y yeast.
Why?
Keep it clean.
Just to slow things down a little bit more?
Slow things down, let the yeast do what it's best at.
Make it even less efficient?
Yeah, so less efficient, slower, but it's also, you know, I kind of equate it as ale yeasts are, you know, that weekend warrior that goes out there and plays softball for 8 hours and is all sweaty and stinky afterwards and, you know, has his own flavor versus, you know, the guy that goes out into his hammock for 2 days in the backyard and swings drinking a beer. There's probably not a lot of flavor change between the two, but, you know, it's the same thing with yeast is, you know, the warmer you go, it throws off more of these esters and flavors. And really changes the character. You know, even if you look at like a Hefeweizen yeast, is you can ferment them kind of low and slow and suppress them, or let it go wild and get this banana clove, you know, phenol bomb.
Sure.
All from the same yeast. The big thing that we noticed is, you know, our fermentation temperature actually raised up a little bit because, you know, I'm looking at specs of the yeast. And what we found was the beer was fermenting a little bit faster. It was clearing up.
It was giving itself a little bit more warmth then.
Yeah, and it was clearing up the diacetyl rest a little bit quicker. So, you know, as the, you know, basically production manager, it's like, okay, well, now I can turn that tank, you know, 8.3 times a year versus 8.5 or the other way around. Doesn't sound like a lot, but, you know, all those weeks and stuff add up. And if I can squeeze another batch every now and again, that helps us. But yeah, and it's just kind of paying attention and, you know, going on previous experience and drawing from what have I used prior and what did I like about it. And, you know, as a brewer, but as a heavy craft beer drinker, I try a lot of different things, and a lot of times I get to try them with the brewer and, oh, what yeast are you using? What hop is this? What barley? And get a little bit more than what you would get off of the label or the beer menu. And you just kind of store that, you know, in the back of your mind. And we have to make those changes. You know, you can remember those beers or revisit them and see the subtle differences.
Did the yeast change impact the way that malt or hops expressed themselves in the beer? And did you have to then adjust any of those other parameters in the recipe in order to kind of, I wouldn't say compensate, but rebalance to the new normal?
Yes, but we were also in the process of addressing some other changes at the same time.
Sure.
And we were already playing with, what the malt was doing and the hops. And, it's, always thinking about, how can we squeak out another half barrel here or there? If we use a little bit less hop, can we maintain that profile? But gain another keg or,
Sure.
But, less hops is also, it costs us a little bit less to make. So
there's some efficiency piece up there. And I shouldn't say this, we're in this world where adding more hops sounds like a good thing, but at some point, there's declining rates of return, and you can load up 10 pounds per barrel, but the impact may not be any more than 4 pounds per barrel. And all you've done is soaked up more liquid and in the hops that you're going to throw away. And you really have, and at some point also, you hit a saturation point where more of those elements of the beer, they can actually pull things out of solution of the beer, which works entirely against their whole goal in this. Now, you're talking about Pilsner, and so that's probably, we're not at a kind of saturation thresholds where that's going to be the issue here. Yeah. But talk to me a little bit about that nonetheless, about how to, how you focused on pinpointing the right amount of hops to, both achieve kind of production goals of making sure that you weren't losing more beer into hop waste at that point. But also making sure that it still captured the kind of character that you were looking for. Also, you mentioned earlier that, started with Saaz hops and then had to make some changes based on what was available to you. Talk to me a little bit about that process too.
Luckily that was done before my time.
Oh, okay.
But they settled on Steer and Aurora, and they went from a German Pilsner malt to a Belgian, Franco-Belgian malt. And we always talk about how, we're technical, we're true to style. And then it's when people kind of hear what's in it, a few people will be like, wait a minute, but those aren't the traditional regular.
That was my thought there, like using a Franco-Belgian Pilsner malt. But I think that's great because that brings us to that question of, is a beer what a beer tastes like, or is a beer a product of the source of the ingredients? And we see so many brewers, especially in the United States these days, brewing beers and calling it a German Pilsner because it uses German Pilsner malt and it uses German hops. So clearly it's a German Pilsner. But it doesn't taste like a German Pilsner. Is it a German Pilsner? There's the big question there. If you make a Bohemian style Pils, it tastes like a Bohemian style Pils, even though it uses Franco-Belgian, Pilsner malt and uses Styrian hops, right?
Styrian Aurora.
Styrian Aurora hops.
And Tettnanger.
Yeah. Should we define things by what they are familiar with to the people that are drinking those things? Or should we define things by the source of the ingredients for those? It's a bigger, broader philosophical question. I don't think we need to answer that one today. But I think it's interesting that you've taken that approach to ingredients to achieve the flavors that you're trying to achieve.
We've been going through a lot of Pilsner malt trials right now. Nothing at scale, and we found that continental malts have a very similar flavor profile. There are certainly nuances from region to region, and prime example of that are Munich versus Vienna malts. Essentially the same malt, founded about the same time, two different guys, just a slightly different direction, matching their city's kind of direction and beer choice, and they evolve from that. But what we find is, we kind of like that old world continental malt flavor. There's a little bit more in depth that we just haven't been able to find in a U.S., a North American Pilsner malt. Is it the soil, or is it everything grown around, the climate? Those changes that we don't have here because we don't mirror where this malt is grown there. But we're just not finding that flavor depth or complexity in the North American malt. So, we're picking out what we like and what we think's good and how that balance works. Steer and Aurora, it's still a classic noble hop. Maybe, not directly out of Germany and everything, but in the same vein, it's
sure.
It's capturing, I think the right
Some
flavor
broader
profile.
idea of Bohemia, right?
Yeah. And, I guess you could argue that little lemon snap that we get in there is not correct, but it balances the beer out and it makes you want to drink more, and it's light and refreshing, and we like it. So if we like it, then we're going to make it the best example that we can, and every batch is going to be just like that other batch. And as I'm talking about all the subtle changes we make, but
no, those are the nice pieces. I mean, I think that as much as and we can run into this. Maybe I'll say it a different way. The farmhouse ale makers have grown comfortable with terroir and building individual ideas of expression. Mm-hmm. Lager brewing is not about building a monocultural idea of one beer and everyone trying to strive towards this singular ideal of what that is. One of the beautiful things about lager brewing is that there is that kind of diversity in it. The brewers achieve different things. They have different flavor goals. They don't need to all make the same exact beer. It's not a singular goal and idea. And there is room for this kind of expression within, even though it is a regimented thing and even though there are expectations around those parameters, I think that it's a beautiful thing that you find that kind of expression. And so you might find brewers making their, Pilsner with French Aramis hops, and that gives it a certain different thing. I love this. You've got your Styrian Aurora hops, and it adds this particular element that's yours. There's a beauty to those. They use Seitz Farm hops, and that's all they use, and that's all they ever use, and it's going to be exactly like this. I love those beers too, but I think that there's this nice piece of finding a character that is also relevant, interesting, and exemplifies a different kind of creative approach to that.
Yeah, and we also have to remember that every town had a brewery.
Right.
We didn't have trucking systems and train and all that, so beers were very local. Very hyper local, and you would just see variants because they drew from the ingredients from around them. And so even a Helles back, you go 25 miles away into a different town, that Helles will taste just slightly different, even though the ingredients might be almost identical. Came from Bob's farm versus, Josephine's farm. Same malt, but just slightly different flavor, and
sure,
it's all the little nuances.
I love it because I've mentioned this before on the podcast, but Jeff Allworth wrote about Kolsch for us in the last issue, and it was just the amazing thing because if you think about it, like you've got Cologne, you've got Dusseldorf, and you can't find a Kolsch outside of Cologne. Like you're just not going to, you go 25 miles away. They don't even make that style of beer.
Yeah.
And so, right, this kind of individual specialization, but I also find, that this kind of character that brewers build is useful. And that as American brewers, as we look at these kinds of models, it's also important to understand how to achieve what parameters you can adjust, which ones you can't, and that's why I love having these kinds of conversations. So we've been talking a lot about Bohemian Pils. Is there any other element that you find, that really helps make your Bohemian Pils your own? Is there a technical process to this? I mean, are there, as you've been going through this, using the yeast that you use, using this Pilsner malt that you use, using these hops that you use, that in any way, are there special tweaks that you've had to find in your production process to kind of pull the good stuff out of them?
No, it's, I guess those special tweaks would be all those things as a brewer that you want to do, and it's just a matter of actually doing them.
Yeah.
I know sometimes as a small craft brewer, you can be overwhelmed by everything, your brew schedule and being understaffed and blah, blah, blah. And you just might not find that, you had time to do that true dump or dump that extra yeast, or, check a beer that's lagering, for 3 weeks and see how it's doing and tasting it along the way. We don't want to take shortcuts, and and as a leader for my team, it's kind of instilling those values and hey, I'm too busy, can you help me out with this, and working as team just to make sure we get all those small little steps that can be forgotten or overlooked, that I feel are important, if not essential, to making a good lager and keeping it clean. And
Sure. Well, let's pivot and talk about some of the kind of other lagers, because you mentioned that this, expanding the lager program was one of the first things that you undertook. Before we do that, there's nothing easy about brewing beer. It's an intricate, time-consuming art. The last thing you need to face is a recall or contamination that can hurt your pride and your pocketbook. Clarion lubricants meet strict purity and performance standards to help make your system 100% food safe. That's protection for your equipment and for your beer. So make the switch to Clarion and ensure your system is running smooth and safe. Go to clarionlubricants.com to learn more. So let's talk about how you built out an even broader lager program and some of the kind of creative impact that you brought to the program.
Sure. It was basically we wanted 4 seasonal beers, one for each season. We decided to go the lager route, and it's when you look at BJCP, there's roughly 150 styles, 2/3 of them or so are ales, and much smaller to choose from. But if you think fall, there really, really is only one lager that people talk about or give a shit about. It's Oktoberfest.
Sure.
So fest beer, that was easy, low hanging fruit.
It's easy to say it, but how'd you make some aesthetic choices about how to brew it? Because, and I'm just speaking because this subject is on our mind, and our new IPA issue that is out now. We've got a whole section on fest beer. And
do I do a Marzen or do I do a fest beer?
Do you do a fest beer or do you do a Marzen? Right.
Yeah.
Well, how did you approach that one?
I hit the history books. And
plug, you should go read Joe Stang's article about this in the latest issue, because the history is really fun and kind of weird about all of this too. Yeah.
It's I just did a presentation for one of the local homebrewers clubs, and this was the topic was Marzen versus fest beer, and I was like, crap, you know what? Every year I have a hard time trying to get the history straight about Oktoberfest, because it is just kind of wacky. It was started as a wedding ceremony. Then it turned into an agricultural festival that kind of kept this, everything going. And, it was all a brown, dark lager. And then Vienna, Munich malts came along, and then we kind of see Marzen beers being introduced. But at the same time, Germany was saying you can't brew between April and August or whatever it was. So brewers work like madmen in March, hence Marzen beer, to get all this beer in caves and lager it over the summer. And then you had a lot of beer in the fall. Fast forward, it's an ever changing style. So even the Marzens were starting to get a little bit lighter. And then, suddenly fest beer, because people wanted, a liter of poundable, drinkable beer that wasn't going to assault their taste buds, so they could continue to eat and drink more, be boozy so they could be drunk and have fun and sing in lots and parades and all that. So trying to figure out what the heck is it a should I go super dark?
Sure,
should
sure.
I go?
And we have the habit in America in particular of ascribing a timelessness to all of this. But I mean, what we're talking about is basically modern history.
Yes.
If you look at the last 100 years of Oktoberfest, like, you know, the number of different beers served at Oktoberfest 60 years ago was pretty diverse, like weirdly diverse compared to how we look at it now. You know, and then the idea of Oktoberfest as Märzen has become this very Americanized thing. Like that's the beer that they sell to Americans is Oktoberfest beer. And yes, that has some root in history 30, 40 years ago, but even 30, 40 years ago, it was starting to shift to more, you know, pale styles of fest beer in order to, again, have people drink more of it and sell more of it, which smart business.
And then, like you said, the export versions were darker and more Märzen-like, which adds more confusion. So, you know, when I say, oh, we're going to do a very traditional fest beer, and you're like, what the heck does that mean?
Tradition, like, you know, right. Are you reaching to 30 years ago, 40 years ago, or 60 years ago? Because those are all different, right? You know, but that's the thing. Like, you know, it's not that these are somehow like written in stone in some history book here. They're constantly evolving, even at Oktoberfest, even in Germany itself. So, you know, right, trying to come up with what a beer, of Oktoberfest beer is, just opens up a whole Pandora's box there.
And then, you know, so once I decide, okay, we're doing fest beer, then it's just like looking at recipes and looking how, you know, how other breweries, and go out and taste beers and what do you like about them, and you know, and then the whole time is like, oh, what's my spin? You know, what am I going to add, kind of make this unique and East Brother, and you know, something that I want to drink, you know, every single year. And you know, went a very traditional route. You know, we were still very small at the time. We had big hop contracts, probably more than we need to use. So I'm going to choose from, you know, the ingredients most readily available to me. And then I'm going to pull them together in kind of a unique way to make our fest beer. Ours is, I would argue, probably a little too on the orange side of golden to be 100% accurate. But you know what? San Francisco Giants are orange. Orange is my favorite color. You know, maybe we'll tweak it that way. You know, when you first brew it and taste it, it's like, okay, I like this. And
what's the recipe look like for that?
We've had a couple iterations, but it's basically Pilsner malt, some Munich, Vienna. I'm going to say we use a little bit of Cara Munich just to give it some color. And as I mentioned before we started this, I should preload. I forget what hops are in it because we brew it once a year. And I want to say it's Steer and Aurora and something else. I know it's Steer.
I told you I wasn't going to ask you questions about these one-off beers that you brew once a year, and then I totally lied because here we are, and now I'm asking you about that.
Which is a totally shame because we just brewed ours just a couple weeks ago.
Which is why we were talking about it in the magazine and now talking about it on the podcast now, because this is the time.
That's right. Oh, I lied. Sorry. It's all middle fro.
Oh, okay.
Probably because never mind. I don't know why I went with middle fruit, but it seemed like the right hop at the right time, and ran with it. Since the original recipe was written, Admiral Maltings in Alameda opened up, and
Craft Maltster over here, for just a little bit further south from you.
Yeah, exactly. 15 to 30 minutes, 45 minutes, depending on traffic. First of all, if you own a brewery, never tell your head brewer that cost isn't a problem on anything.
Right.
You know, but I saw this opportunity. It's, you know, a lot of brewers don't actually get to see how malt is made. And we have that resource right down the street. I like the malt. I like that it's all California grown. It is absolutely the freshest malt that we can get a hold of, and something with fest beer, it was an easy sell because it really is still kind of a festival around the harvest and what's been grown in the area and highlighting the bounty coming from out out of that. And I like the malt, and they have
So which Admiral malt are you using this? Because it's not all the malt, is it? You're still using your standard Pilsner base malt?
No, we use the Admiral Pilsner malts.
Okay.
Midway, which is their Munich, and Pacific Victor, which is their Vienna malt. We do use a little bit of Environment Cara Munich in there, but really for nothing more than just to enhance.
I was just going
color.
to make a snarky joke about, using small amounts of craft malt just to make the marketing claim towards it. But no, you're going all in.
I am, friends with the founder, and we hang out quite often. And I always ask them, what percentage of your malt do we need to have in the beer? Because they will only serve beer made with their malt over their tap room right there at the malt house.
Malt house, yeah.
Thank you. And but I that's kind of cheating. It's
we're like selling 24% of your brewery to a multinational concern, so that you're underneath the 25% cap, right?
Yeah,
okay,
exactly.
I get you.
And but I really like the malt, and so it was an easy transition from the original recipe into that. And it just we're sitting here drinking the Pre-Prohibition Lager, and I think that's a great example of something off the shelf that you can buy versus something fresh and local, and all the flavor nuances that it brings. And I think it just made the beer great. I think it was a pretty solid beer, the first batch, and good first pass at a recipe, and took away some thoughts of how we could brew it better the next year. Luckily the iterations are once a year, so people don't really remember what it was exactly. So we have a little bit more leeway, but yeah, we just we've been able to kind of find, we're really happy with it. And
so talk to me about that, because you come out of using a pretty standard Pilsner base malt in a lot of your lagers, and then you start using a craft malted Pilsner that of American grown barley grown in the state of California, malted by a small craft maltster here. And are there floor malts?
Floor malt.
So it's all floor malt. That has to, from a production standpoint for you, throw some challenges into the overall mix.
Yes and no. But
what are the points of difference between using craft malt and using the kind of continental malt that you were much more familiar with brewing your own lagers?
Freshness. It's right now lead time on continental malts is about 6 months. If I remember my last conversation with my supplier, at least 6 months. It takes, to get from Europe here to California, it's a minimum of 6 months. So that malt has been malted, kilned, bagged, packaged, put on a cargo ship, container cargo ship, cross, lots of time. With the craft maltster, it's coming off of the field, it's malted, and sometimes you can still kind of feel the warmth from the malting process, or from the kilning process in the bags. I joke with them. I'm like, you should do little bundles of this so we can make it car air freshener, because we'll get a pallet of malt, 2,000 pounds. When it comes into the building, even in our large space, you can smell the malt. You're like, Rob and Chris have come in, and you're like, are you brewing today? And I was like, no, we just got malt from Admiral. And it's, that freshness that you're smelling, and then we're using it right away, and we're trying to capture it all in the beer, and it just translates. It comes through. The comparison I like to use is, with the Pre-Pro, we were using kind of a generic 6-row barley that, maybe took a year to get to us. And we started using Admiral's Atlas, which is a locally grown 6-row when I first tasted the
They're
beer,
locally growing 6-row out here now.
yeah, for generations. Ben Work, it's been in his family.
You hear that, Matt Riggs? They're growing 6-row out here too.
Yeah.
They're keeping it alive.
It's only been used for feed since Prohibition. So there's a good chance that, that first batch that we got was the first time that 6-row had seen to be made beer in almost 100 years, which is awesome. But I was like, when I first tasted this beer, and I was like getting honeysuckle and clover and all these just really delicate, nuanced flavors. And it dawned on me, and I was like, I'm tasting everything that helped germinate that barley in his field, because it's a reflective, the bees are pulling pollen from X, Y, and Z close to his fields. And I was kind of tasting that for the first time, and it made the beer. And then you kind of translate that across, all their malts. They're all coming within the state of California, and good farming practices, and it just comes through. It's great to be able to like use the best ingredients that you can all the time.
Sure.
It's like if I was a chef, I could go down to the dock and buy that fish directly from the fisherman, or I can buy it, been sitting on ice or frozen, coming from wherever.
Sure.
You're going to taste the difference between those two pieces of fish.
Now, on the flip side of that, sometimes it's not about that intensity of flavor or that biggest, brightest kind of bouquet from it. And sometimes you don't want it to be that loud. Sometimes you want some of those subtle characters, especially in the kind of lager beers that you're brewing. In that kind of scenario, have you found that you need to dial some things down a little bit when you're using this kind of craft malt in that kind of space? Or you just lean straight into it and say, we're going for it.
We're going for it.
Sure.
It's there. Why do we drink lagers? Or, what makes a good lager from a bad one? And, you look at malt bills, and most lagers are really less than a handful of malts.
Right.
You see something more than 3, 4 is probably rare, until you get into the the Baltic porters and whatnot.
You're talking about 3 or 4 percentage points.
Different malts.
Of total different malts, right?
And a lot of time, our Bow Pills uses 2 malts.
Yeah.
And one really is, I don't know, it's not I wouldn't call it a process aid, but it's kind of, we're enhancing one of the aspects of the beer carapils that we like, or makes it a little bit more desirable. Pre-Prohibition, it's 1 6-row malt and flaked maize, and how do you coax? I want as much flavor impact as I can from that malt, and I still want to balance it off of an appropriate hop, bitterness and flavor and aroma, and you never really want any one of those cast of characters to outshine the other. The malt tastes good because you have enough supporting hop there to, balance the sweetness and make your senses more attuned to some of those flavors. Everything has a purpose, and just, it takes a lot of restraint.
Yeah. So as I'm thinking about this, you mentioned using middle fruit in this, and you just used middle fruit to use middle fruit, but the first time that this, 6-row or your floor malted Admiral stuff comes in for your fest beer, and you start thinking about the way that those things are going to go, you've designed this recipe in your mind based on the assumptions that you have around how these things taste and how those aromas reflect themselves. And then you get those actual ingredients in, and they're maybe a little bit different, maybe a little brighter, bolder, more present than you expected them to be. How does that impact? Do you make creative changes on the fly? Do you rethink some of these things? Do you then brew and then taste and smell and then make the adjustments after that point and then try to tweak and fine tune? What does that creative piece of the process look like?
We just brewed it, and then it's at this point we only had 2 batches. We had last year's batch, which I probably still have. Well, that's 4 years ago. Probably still have in the cooler, and you brew the new batch, and all right, let's go do a little vertical, and that can from a year ago is probably a little oxidized and more authentic German now. But we can look
the way that all those beers taste after they put them on a ship and ship them over here.
But there's usually enough of the flavor there to remind you what you really liked about it or what you wanted to fix. And then you do this, the new version, and okay, how did this go? And then what am I going to do for next year? And more importantly is write all that stuff down, because
if you don't keep the notes,
in 42 weeks when you're making those purchases decisions on stuff, you're probably not going to remember what you wanted to do. I see no wrong in going after the freshest ingredients as possible. There's a good chance those nuanced flavors that you were seeking in kind of like the regular generic, more readily stuff, it's just more pop and delicious, there, and you appreciate it more. I also find it interesting as that beer ages, those things you were most excited with, and it kind of is stepping down week after week after week, and it gets to a point you're like, oh wow, this reminds me exactly what it was last year, and you're like, oh, I kind of gained like 6-8 weeks of freshness, and being something really excited about something, to versus like, oh yeah, this is a good beer, it's a good representative of what it should be. Drink fresh beer, please.
Over time, it'll turn back into that thing that's just as good as you remember it. But if you want it really exciting, drink it fresh.
It's we live in the land of sourdough, and you buy that loaf of sourdough fresh from the bakery day one, it's fantastic, and then the next day it's a little bit more muted, and after a while it almost kind of just tastes like stale white bread, and go for the flavor.
For sure. Well, we're getting on a time here, Paul. In the big picture, what's next for East Brother? What beers are on the horizon? What are you excited about most to pursue creatively and technically here in the future?
That's a hard question, because right now it's been all about keeping up. We did okay last year. This year, kegs are back and it's turning on. We seem to still be selling the same number of cases and canned beer as we did before. But I'm looking...
And then draft is just getting layered in right on top of that.
And people need to restock. We are taking a look at a couple of different styles of, I don't want to say like, in lack of better terms, maybe like an everyday beer. Almost kind of, I don't want to say lawnmower, but maybe something on the ale side that is thirst quenching and a little bit larger quantity. But what I'm really looking forward to,
nobody brews a golden ale or a blonde ale at large scale in this state. No one does that.
Not at all. But more importantly is our tap room is back open. It's filling up again, and we're almost out of the summer push, so I should have some free tanks popping up here soon. And I just kind of want to do some fun stuff. We're going to do our Belgian Tripel soon, and I'd love to repitch yeast. That's the only one that is really outside of our normal use plan. So trying to get another use out of it is always exciting. But yeah, I just, we're going to bring our casks back.
Yes. Cask ale is coming back.
We're about a week away from some English, oatmeal stout. And then we're going to follow that up with some English pale, which I'm excited about. It's too bad we didn't time it better, because who knew that England was going to be almost champions or whatever, but cask But anyhow,
It's the best outcome for England. I know. I mean, it was funny because I made the bet with my wife, and I put my my money on Italy, only because England is so good at losing, and that there are just. I mean, there are like nobody loses the big game, the most important game, like England does.
and the
And-
Chicago Cubs.
Yeah, yeah.
But they, you know, the Cubs even won one in the last 10 years.
But
or whatever.
England is one of the best at getting there, and then of course they figured out how to do this in the Euro finals, and just lose in spectacular fashion, like coming out ahead early and then
fastest goal in history.
right, and then somehow falling off, and then allowing an equalizer in the second half, and then losing it in penalty kicks. I mean, it's the most tragic ending, but that tragic endings are what make for brilliant drinking songs.
That's right.
And so I think that this loss will spur on beautiful drinking songs in English pubs, for the next few decades. And so they can remember back. And I think that that'll ultimately bring them way more pleasure than winning the game.
Absolutely.
But I digress. Paul Liszewski from East Brother Beer Company, thanks for joining me here on the podcast. If people want to learn more about East Brother, where do they find you guys?
eastbrotherbeer.com, or you can just stop by our tap room over here in Richmond, 1001 Canal Boulevard. Follow the signs, you'll eventually see us. But yeah, we'd love to have you out here and
in person,
yes.
because we can do that now. G&D makes the best damn chillers in the world, as Paul here can attest to. Set your compass by Roar North Star Pills. Old Orchard offers consistent product and reliable supply. Brewmation puts you in control to design a brewery that fits your needs and make your system 100% food safe with Clarion lubricants. If you'd like to support the podcast, subscribe to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. If you're a pro brewer, of course, we've got our pro all access stuff on the Brewing Industry Guide site, and we would appreciate your support for that. Paul, thanks for joining me on the podcast. It's been a pleasure to talk about lager brewing with you.
My pleasure. Thanks for coming by, Jamie.
Yeah, cheers.
Cheers.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com, or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.